Emma Caldwell was rinsing the last plate in her tiny kitchen when the phone rang. Sharp, sudden, and unexpected. No message before. No "how've you been?" Just a voice she hadn't heard in years, one that still carried the weight of blood. "Emma, you need to come to Willow Creek." Her father's voice, Richard Caldwell, was clipped and cool, a man who never wasted words, but beneath the cold edge she heard something unfamiliar. Urgency. "It's time you understood what I've built." Willow Creek, just a name to Emma, a forgotten place from fading photographs, filled with dust, horses, and the kind of sunsets that bled into the sky. A place where her mother left, her father stayed, and she never quite belonged. In Seattle, she lived small, quiet, invisible. The days blended into each other. Work, apartment, city lights, she no longer found beautiful. Something had always been missing. A quiet ache she couldn't name. Maybe that's why she didn't argue this time. Maybe she was tired of the silence. The drive was long, endless highways giving way to open land, each mile peeling away the city's hold. By late afternoon, she turned down a dirt road, the sun a fireball sinking low. Then it appeared, the house, weathered wood standing proud against the horizon, surrounded by golden fields and a stillness that felt like memory. Emma stepped out, boots meeting gravel, wind tugging at her hair. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with something else. Something waiting. In that moment, as the last light kissed the rooftops of Willow Creek Ranch, Emma Caldwell knew everything was about to change. Willow Creek Ranch. The house stood before her like something pulled from an old dream, vast, weathered, silent. Time had shaped it, not ruined it. Silvered wood beams, stone steps kissed with moss, a wide porch wrapped the front like open arms, wildflowers spilling through the cracks. No one waited. Only wind sweeping across the porch and the distant thrum of hooves echoing from the far pastures. Then the door opened. Richard Caldwell, tall and unyielding like the land itself. His eyes skimmed over her without settling, cold as the years between them. No hug, no welcome home. "Have a look around," he said, voice flat, distant. "The new foreman will show you the ropes starting tomorrow. His name's Wyatt." And that was it. He turned and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Emma on the porch, standing in the shadow of a house that held no warmth. Only ghosts. That night, she slept in a guest room just off the main hall. The four-poster bed was layered in quilts soft as clouds. She left the window cracked, letting in the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves she hadn't heard in years. The sounds didn't scare her. They wrapped around her. And Emma slept, not from exhaustion, but because something in her had shifted. Slowly, quietly, but undeniably. First encounter with Wyatt. The sound of boots on the porch roused Emma from sleep. Morning light spilled through the window, golden and soft like a whispered secret. She pulled on a pair of worn jeans and a plain blouse, her hair still tangled from a restless night. When she stepped outside, he was already there. Leaning against a fence post, Wyatt Hale looked like something carved from the land itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, his flannel sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-warmed, sinewed arms. His hair was tousled, dark brown, but it was his eyes, deep, steady like dusk settling over the Montana hills, that caught her breath. "You're Richard's daughter?" he asked, voice low, rough like the wind across wheat. "Emma, right?" She nodded. He stepped forward, offering a horsebrush. Their fingers touched, calloused and warm, and something sparked beneath her skin. "Like this," he said, stepping behind her, guiding her hand to the chestnut mare named Ruby. His chest brushed her back. His breath touched her neck. Emma froze, not in fear, but something else, something new. "You're green," he teased gently, easing back, a smirk tugging at his lips that made her blush bloom hot across her cheeks. She didn't answer, just met his gaze and didn't look away. It was a simple moment, brief, quiet. But in the brush of his fingers, in the way his voice wrapped around her name, something had shifted. Something had begun. After that first morning with Ruby and Wyatt's steady gaze, the days at Willow Creek no longer passed in quiet. Something had started, Not loud, not fast, but deep and certain. Emma began learning how to ride. She was stiff, tense, gripping the reins too tightly, her back rigid with nerves. Wyatt didn't laugh. He simply stepped closer, placed a hand gently on her shoulder and said, "Relax. She's not going to kill you." She laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound that surprised even herself. And for a fleeting moment, a spark of warmth lit up his usually stoic eyes. A half smile, gone in a blink, but it stayed with her all day. They worked side by side, feeding horses, hauling hay, mucking stalls. Sweat on her brow, dust on her jeans, and yet every accidental brush of hands, every lean, do-close moment felt electric. Not overwhelming, just there. Jokes began to slip between them. Wyatt called her city girl with cupcake hands. She rolled her eyes but smiled easier around him than she had with anyone in years. One morning, he tossed her the reins. "You ready?" They rode through the fields, the golden sunlight cascading over them like a warm embrace from the heavens. The wind tangled her hair and her cheeks flushed, not from the heat. Wyatt rode ahead, glancing back every few steps, and each look undid her a little more. They stopped by a creek, the water clear and quiet. Wyatt tied the horses, then turned to her. "Come on down," he said, reaching up. She barely had time to react before his hands were at her waist, lifting her gently off the saddle. Her feet touched the ground, but his hands didn't leave. Instead, his thumb brushed slow, deliberate circles along her waist. Light, intentional. "You okay?" he asked, voice low, his eyes locked onto hers. She nodded, unable to speak. He handed her a canteen. She drank, lips glistening, then passed it back. But his eyes, they lingered, not on her face, on her mouth. Something passed between them, quiet, heavy. A pull neither moved toward, but neither stepped back from. Choosing to prolong the moment, they decided to walk back, leading their horses side by side, allowing the lingering silence to speak the words they weren't yet ready to say. Their horses trailing behind and their arms brushing occasionally in the breeze. That night, Emma lay in bed, fingers tracing the place he had touched. The skin still remembered, the air still held his scent. And for the first time in a very long time, she wanted more. Their connection grew slowly, through shared chores and sweat, through playful jabs. "You sure those city hands can hold reins?" and her dry replies. She found herself laughing more, feeling lighter in a place that had once felt foreign. One late afternoon, after riding out past the ridge, they stopped beneath an old oak. Wyatt laid out a blanket and gestured for her to sit. She did, folding her knees beneath her sundress, her breath catching from the ride. The sun was melting into the horizon, casting a golden pink hue across the plains. Emma hugged her knees, watching birds sweep low in the distance. "It's so quiet," she murmured. Wyatt sat beside her, close, not quite touching, but almost. Then his hand reached out, resting lightly on her bare arm. His thumb began tracing small circles into her skin, slow, delicate, thoughtful. She froze, but didn't pull away. Each circle burned, not with fire, but with awareness, like her skin had just remembered it could feel. "What are you thinking?" he asked, voice soft, barely above a whisper. She turned to him. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, she didn't remember who she used to be. "I'm thinking," she whispered, "maybe I'm not the same girl I was when I got here." Wyatt didn't answer. He didn't have to. His eyes told her everything. On the ride back, they said little. But Emma's arm still tingled where his fingers had moved, those quiet circles spinning long after the sun had gone down. That evening, they rode back blanketed in dust and gold, the last light of day burning soft across the plains. Emma thought it might end with a quiet goodnight, a smile, a brush of hands. But Wyatt's eyes, when they reached the stables, held something else, darker, deeper, a decision. "Come with me," he said, low, tight. He led her behind the barn to the hayloft, a place dim and still, lit only by the glow of a single lantern. The scent of hay, sweat, and summer heat wrapped around them. "I should tell you," he started, but his voice faltered. Then he kissed her. It wasn't careful. It wasn't sweet, it was fire. All the restraint he'd shown, all the watching, all the waiting, it burned now, poured into every touch, every breath. They came undone together, limbs tangled, shirts half off, backs pressed against hay bales and rough wood. She felt his hands like they were learning her, mapping her curves, her breath, her softness. Every gasp, every arch of her body said, "Yes, I want this too." And when they lay there, breathless, the lantern flickering above them, Wyatt's voice cut through the quiet. "Emma," he said softly, "there's something you need to know." She turned to him, chest still rising and falling. "I'm not just the ranch foreman," he said, voice thick. "My full name is Wyatt Hale Whitmore." She blinked. "Whitmore?" He nodded once. "My family owns Whitmore Livestock Exports, land, cattle, money, more than your father probably. I'm the sole heir." Emma sat up slowly. Her mind spun, disbelief, hurt, confusion, all crashing into one. "I came here to run from all of that, to get away from the weight of a life already decided." He reached for her, fingers brushing her cheek with aching gentleness. "But then you happened." She didn't answer, just looked at him. Her hand slid over his, lacing their fingers. "With you," he whispered. "I'm not Whitmore. I'm just Wyatt." And in that small, quiet barn, surrounded by hay and heat, Emma understood. This was no longer just a summer escape. This was real. The days that followed unraveled like silk, slow, sensual, and soaked in fire. Emma and Wyatt didn't need grand declarations. Their love spoke in glances, in the electric brush of fingertips. Each time he touched her, it felt like he was memorizing her skin, piece by piece. They began taking trips, small escapes that felt like entire worlds. One weekend, Wyatt drove them to a cabin tucked deep in the pines. It was rustic, quiet, a wood-burning stove and a bed that creaked with every whispered word. That night, under flannel sheets and firelight, Emma lay curled against him, her cheek on his chest, listening to the rhythm of his heart like it was the only sound that mattered. His hands didn't just touch. They healed, reached inside the empty corners of her soul, and filled them. Sunday morning, he met her by the stables. The sun hadn't yet cleared the hills, but his gaze was already blazing. He didn't need to say a word, just a small smile, a silent nod, and she was his all over again. They rode through the fields, golden grass brushing against her boots, the wind tugging at her hair and skirt. Emma felt alive in a way she never had before, like each heartbeat belonged not just to her, but to the man riding just a breath ahead. They stopped near a small lake, its waters glass still beneath the Montana sky. Wyatt laid out a blanket, pulled her down beside him, his arm looping around her waist like it had always been there. "This place," he murmured, fingers drawing slow patterns along her spine, "is where I come to breathe." She leaned into him, her voice a whisper. "And now?" He turned, his lips grazing her ear, voice rough with emotion. "Now, I breathe you." His hand slid up her back, beneath the fabric of her blouse, his fingers warm and sure. He kissed her neck, slow, reverent, as though learning her pulse by heart. Emma melted into him, arms wrapping around his broad shoulders, her breath catching in her throat. The air around them thickened with something heavy and tender. Here, in the hush of open land, beneath the wide Montana sky, they weren't just a runaway heir and a quiet city girl. They were each other's everything. After days of drifting through pine-wood cabins and starlit hotel windows, Emma had come to understand something true. Loving Wyatt wasn't about falling, it was about becoming. She hadn't lost herself in him. She'd found herself, piece by piece. So when he came to her that evening, reins in hand, eyes quiet but certain, she didn't ask. She just nodded and followed. They rode across the fields one last time, the sun casting honey gold light over the grass, her hair dancing behind her in the breeze. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Silence between them now was not emptiness. It was understanding. Under the same oak tree where his fingers had once drawn circles into her skin, they stopped. Wyatt took his time, unsaddled the horse, spread out the blanket, then sat beside her. His hands slipped into hers, familiar, grounding. "I spent so long running from everything," he said softly, his gaze steady. "And then I met you, and realized some things aren't meant to be escaped. Some things are meant to be found." He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside, a simple ring. No sparkle, no spectacle, just the quiet gleam of everything that had brought them here. "Emma," he said, voice low and a little rough, "will you marry me? Not because of who I am, but because with you, I'm exactly who I want to be." Their wedding didn't happen in a grand cathedral or beneath a crystal chandelier. It happened out in the open, on the very same field where they had once ridden side by side, where an old oak tree bore witness to the first circle he ever traced on her skin, where love had arrived softly but stayed fiercely. That summer, Willow Creek bloomed in golden light. Wooden benches lined a narrow aisle of grass. Wildflowers were woven into garlands, into Emma's hair, and hung from the low branches like blessings. Not far off, the horses stood still, quiet, as if they too knew the day was sacred. Wyatt waited at the end of the path, dressed in white linen, eyes fixed on only one thing: Emma, walking toward him. She didn't come alone. Her father, Richard Caldwell, the man who had once been a silence she could never fill, now held her hand. He didn't speak, but as he placed her hand into Wyatt's, he nodded, a small, solemn gesture. But in that nod was every word a father could give. "I have you," she whispered to Wyatt, eyes glassy with tears. "And with you, I have everything." Their vows weren't rehearsed, they weren't showy, just honest words carried on the wind. "Whatever tomorrow brings," Wyatt said, "I'll choose you, like I chose you today, like I'll choose you always." 6 years later, laughter echoed across the same field. 2 horses galloped under the late afternoon sun, each carrying a parent and one of their twin daughters. 2 little girls with wild brown curls and brighter eyes. Emma rode with Lily, who clung to her waist and squealed with delight, wind pulling at her hair. Wyatt rode with Ellie, the curious twin, who always wanted to go faster than Mommy. They rode through the land they had built a life on, sunlight streaking their shoulders, the girls' giggles ringing into the wide blue sky. Sometimes, Emma would glance back, meet Wyatt's gaze across the breeze. And when their eyes locked, she'd see it, that same steady love, that same quiet promise. And she'd smile. Love, she had learned, wasn't a fairy tale. It was a journey, dusty, imperfect, filled with quiet moments and long nights. But it was also made of slow circles on skin, whispered words at dusk, and the weight of a hand that never let go. And now, that love lived on, in the way her daughters laughed, in the rhythm of hooves on grass, in the breath they shared as they raced across the fields. Sometimes love doesn't need to be loud or grand. It just needs to be true and brave enough to stay.